Hey there and welcome back to another Avatar video. And today, we'll be talking a little bit about the Legend of Korra. And usually, my videos revolve mostly around The Last Airbender, as I have a firmer understanding of the events and the characters of that show compared to its successor. But today, I'm throwing that precedent to the wind to talk about one of the characters from Legend of Korra. And honestly, she's one of the best written and most compelling characters within the entire franchise. And I want to talk through how she has perhaps one of the most tragic stories of all the characters in the show. And of course, that character is Lin Beifong. And you might be sitting there thinking, what? Lin does not have the saddest life story of all the characters in the franchise. What do you mean? There are so many characters that have had way worse experiences than her. And yeah, that is kind of true. There are a number of characters that have had much lower lows than her. But I think there are very few that have had such a consistently mediocre life as Lin Beifong. God, when you really sit down and think about it, it gets more and more depressing the more you think through her life story. It's just a big grey blob of, meh. From the beginning, her life was destined to be a little bit more difficult than most. She was born to Toph Beifong, who was widely considered to be the greatest of all time earthbender and the pioneer of metal bending. She was always going to have a lot to live up to, pretty much the same as all the children of the original gang. Their parents were heroes and prodigies of one form or another, and thus they had to grow up with that shadow looming over the top of them. But for Lin, this initial pressure was compounded by her less than adequate home life, to put it pretty bluntly. I mean, her mum was just not very good at being a mum. Throughout the course of The Legend of Korra, we learn that from the get-go, Toph was very much checked out of actually doing any real parenting. She herself had had very overprotective parents, and thus she didn't want that for her kids. But in classic fashion, as these things often go, she overcorrected and approached parenting with truly impressive apathy, pretty much letting her kids do whatever they liked. And well, yeah, it's pretty shit parenting. And so Lin and Sue began to compete for her attention. Lin by trying to follow in her footsteps as a member of the police force, and Sue by acting out, becoming a criminal. Both to try and elicit some sort of response. And of course, this set the two sisters up on a collision course, as this acting out came in the form of criminal behaviours, which meant that by the book Lin was forced to intervene, which in turn earned her permanent facial scarring. That's nice. And this in turn was completely swept under the rug by her own mother, who ripped up Lin's report and sent Sue off to live with her rich grandparents to allow things to blow over. And all of this because it wouldn't be a good look for the chief's daughter to have been caught doing things like this. So that's already an impressive amount of trauma for Lin so far. The absentee nature of her mother really culminating in this family's implosion, which in turn leaves her estranged from both her sister and her mother until the actual events of the show itself. And not estranged in the way of, oh, you feel good after cutting out toxic relations, but in a far more bitter context of Lin desperately wanting them to take accountability and constantly having that thrown back in her face. Ouch. Oh, and by the way, she apparently spent her whole life asking her mum who her dad was and never got a response until her mum was super old and her dad could potentially already be dead. And well, I doubt that's going to give her much closure, but okay. And so let's skip ahead to the future. She reunites with her family, and guess what? What is the overwhelming opinion from basically every character? How do they respond to Lin? Well, they make her out to be the most unreasonable member of the family of all time. The one who simply can't let things go after everybody's already made peace. Despite the fact that nobody's offered a true, proper apology. Sue, Toph, Korra, they pretty much all double down on the Lin is unreasonable angst train. They belittle her. They gaslight her. Lin, why are you being so unreasonable about all of this? It's been years. We've let it all go. Why can't you let it go? It's really holding back the family. Why do you want to hurt us like this, Lin? It hurts our feelings that you're angry, etc., etc. And shit, when even the show's own narrative frames your terrible life as kind of your own fault and that you need to let things go, you know you've just taken a massive L. But of course, the dreary existence of Lin Beifong does not end here. Because even aside from her family life and her relationships to them, her actual personal life seems to be nothing to write home about either. Now, like I said before, Lin grew up as part of the next generation of Team Avatar, with all the children of the various different members, and over the course of her life, she cultivated a close relationship with Tenzin, Aang and Katara's youngest son. And at the time of his birth, and for most of his life, he was one of only 2 airbenders, until the death of his father left him as the last of his kind, the head of the Air Nation, and the only member of the Air Nation who actually maintains the ability to bend air. Kind of an important thing. And now for a lot of their youth, it seemed like they were romantically involved, at least from what the show says, and they seemed to be very much in love. And even by the time of the show, when they've not been together for well over a decade, you can see there still is some genuine affection underneath all the bitterness and resentment. But of course, since this is the life of Lin Beifong, she doesn't get to have happiness, right? So let's have all of that tumble down, because ultimately, Tenzin felt responsibility to have children and continue the restoration of the air nomads and the art of airbending. And I don't think it's ever actually specified in the show itself, but I don't think that Lin seems like she has a whole lot of desire for that sort of life. And indeed, I think that one of the creators or the writers or something said that this was the main reason for their deteriorating relationship, that he wanted children and that she didn't. Now, don't quote me on that, but I think I remember hearing something about that in the past. So yeah, already from that it becomes quite clear that their relationship was always going to have an expiration date, and there's no shame in that. Nobody's at fault for that. It's just how it plays out that makes you feel a bit sad for Lin. But then, and also don't quote me 100% on this either, I'm not quite sure of the relationship timeline here. The way it felt when they explained things in season 1, it very much felt like Tenzin immediately dumps Lin for Pema as soon as she comes out about her feelings towards him. So from Lin's perspective, it probably felt like their relationship was on borrowed time at first, but I don't think that makes it hurt any less to have one of his underlings, acolytes, declare their love for him, which in turn spurs him into dumping her immediately and shacking up with her. Also, I very much doubt that they just express mutual feelings and do nothing but talk, and then he goes off to end things. Life's messy. I think there was most likely some overlap. And thus, it didn't really end on her terms, and she felt cheated and shamed by her long-term boyfriend dumping her for a much younger woman, who then gives him everything he ever wanted. Woof! I wonder why she seems so bitter and jaded towards everything at the start of season 1. Whew, literally taking L's left and right year after year. It must weigh down the soul. But the trauma expressed does not stop there for our beloved chief of police, because there's more pain and suffering. Like that time she gets massive, I guess, survivor's guilt from when they do the raid on the Sato mansion and a bunch of her officers get kidnapped and their bending is stripped away. Or when she feels like she has to quit her job as chief of police, a position she's dedicated her life to, in order to adequately fight back against Aman and the Equalists. Or perhaps that time she sacrifices herself against said Equalists to buy time for the airbending family to escape Republic City in the first place, and in the end, her efforts just being futile, as they ended up getting captured anyway and need to be rescued by Korra, while she ends up losing her bending for a time, which, well, I think that would be very traumatic, like losing part of yourself. And honestly, being bloodbent in the first place is probably very painful. Even after you get your powers back, I could see it taking a massive toll on you psychologically. But then she just keeps soldiering on, ready to suffer in many more ways. Whew, lovely. So yeah, Lin Beifong. Is there a sadder arc than hers? Like just consistently sad? I mean, there are characters that go through things that I would argue are far worse. Zuko, scarred by his father, exiled and abused, but hey, he got his happy ending. Iroh loses his son, but he finds happiness in raising his nephew and redeeming his actions as a Fire Nation general. Aang, his people were genocided, and he got warped into the future, losing the majority of people that he knew. But hey, at least he did get a happy family that he wanted in the end, etc, etc. There's lots of characters with lots of trauma, but I don't know if there's any character, or at least any good guy character, that has to put up with the level of unrelenting bullshit that Lin does, except maybe Cabbage Man. And it's just on such a consistent basis. And it's never really talked about. She has her issues, they never get dealt with, and everyone just moves on while she stews in her bitterness. And it's very depressing. Realistic, but very depressing nonetheless. I mean, it kind of feels like a villain origin story if you ask me. And so anyway, I'll probably end the video there. Long story short, Lin's life is unexpectedly shitty. And that's just her whole arc. Her life's hard. And she cops the blame for being a bit upset about this fact. The end. And so, with all that being said, I'll just remind you that these are only my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of all this? You agree that Lin is perhaps Avatar's most tragic character? Or at least the most tragic major character? Or maybe you disagree, and you think I've overblown all of this. I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.